You are the type of owner who would never leave your dog behind. Not willingly, not without a fight. But Sergeant Miller was that kind of owner too, and he still walked away. What he didn't know, what nobody told him, was what happened to that dog after the ship disappeared over the horizon. In the early 1950s, thousands of American soldiers shipped out to Korea carrying rifles, rations, and in some cases, a leash. Their dogs weren't pets. They were partners trained to detect ambushes, find the wounded, and move through darkness when men could not. And when the war ended, those dogs were left behind in ways that still echo today. His name was Miller, Staff Sergeant James Miller, from a small town in rural Ohio that nobody outside the county had ever heard of. He'd grown up with dogs his whole life, hunting dogs, farm dogs, the kind of animals that slept at the foot of your bed and woke you before the alarm. So when the Army offered him a position as a scout dog handler in 1952, it didn't feel like a military assignment. It felt like something he was built for. The dog they gave him was a male, around 2 years old, lean and serious-eyed with a coat the color of a storm cloud. The Army had already given him a designation, a number, a file, a kennel assignment. Miller gave him a name. He called him Duke. They trained together for 11 weeks at a facility in the American South before shipping out. 11 weeks is not a long time, but when you spend that much of it sleeping 6 feet from the same animal, reading his body language before your coffee gets cold, learning the difference between his alert posture and his anxious one, something builds between you that doesn't need a long time to become permanent. Duke was trained to work in silence. No barking, no whining, no reaction that might give away a patrol's position. He moved on a long lead ahead of Miller, nose down, ears rotating like radar dishes. When he stopped, really stopped, weight shifting back, muscles tensing, Miller stopped too. Every man behind him stopped, because Duke's instincts had already saved them twice before Miller stopped counting. The terrain of the Korean peninsula is nothing like Ohio. The winters are brutal. The hills roll endlessly in every direction, dense with brush that hides everything. Miller would later tell his daughter that Korea felt like a place designed to swallow men whole. But Duke moved through it like he understood something Miller didn't. Like the land had already spoken to him in a language only dogs could hear. For 8 months, they worked together on the line. Scout patrols, perimeter sweeps, the occasional terrifying move through contested ground at 3 in the morning when the only light came from artillery fire on the ridge above them. Duke never failed a mission. Not once. And then, in the spring of 1953, Sergeant Miller received his rotation orders. He was going home. Here is the part of this story that most people do not know, the part that was quietly built into the structure of the military dog program itself. Like a fault line nobody wanted to talk about. During the Korean War, military working dogs were not classified the same way human soldiers were. They were equipment. Officially, the Army's paperwork listed them under material assets, right alongside Jeep tires and field radios. And equipment didn't rotate home with its operator. Equipment was reassigned, redistributed, transferred. Miller knew this in the abstract, but knowing a policy and standing in front of it are two completely different things. The morning he received his orders, he went to the kennel officer and asked directly, plainly, what would happen to Duke. The officer told him what he was authorized to say. Duke would be reassigned to another handler. He would continue his service. He was a valuable asset. The Army took care of its assets. Miller asked if he could take Duke home. The answer was no. He asked if he could at least meet the next handler, brief him personally, hand the lead to someone he trusted. The answer was that it wasn't standard procedure. He asked if there was any way to guarantee Duke's safety, any paperwork, any transfer form, anything he could sign. The officer looked at him the way military officers look at men who are asking questions that have already been answered. He told Miller his transport departed in 48 hours. Miller spent those 48 hours with Duke in a way that probably looked strange to anyone watching. He wasn't training him. He wasn't running drills. He was just sitting with him in the kennel, outside the kennel, wherever they'd let him be, talking to him the way men talk to dogs when they do not know how else to say what they are feeling. Duke would put his head on Miller's knee and look up at him with those serious gray eyes, and Miller would scratch behind his ears and tell him he was a good dog. The best dog. That somebody was going to take real good care of him. He believed it when he said it. The morning the transport left, Miller did not look back at the kennel. He made himself stare at the horizon, at the water, at anything else. He told himself that Duke would be fine, that the army knew what it was doing, that a dog like Duke trained, tested, proven would be valuable to someone, and that someone would recognize it. He told himself all of this on the ship, and then again when he got home, and again for the next several years, in the quiet moments when Duke's face surfaced in his memory without warning. He was home in Ohio by summer. His family threw a small party. His mother made a pie. His younger brother shook his hand like a man greeting another man for the first time, because that's what Miller was now, something slightly different from the person who'd left. He got a job. He got married. He had 2 daughters. He built a life the way returning soldiers build lives, which is to say carefully, one ordinary day at a time, keeping the harder things in a room that doesn't have a door marked clearly on the outside. He got another dog eventually, a good one, a family dog, sweet-tempered and loyal. His daughters grew up loving that dog the way children love dogs, completely and without complication. But Duke lived in that other room, not as grief exactly, more as an unanswered question. Miller had never found out what happened to him after that morning, and for years he told himself that was fine, that not knowing was the same as things being okay. It wasn't. In 1971, Miller's older daughter came home from college with a book she'd found in the campus library. It was a nonfiction account of the American military dog program, its history, its structure, its outcomes. She handed it to her father over dinner, casually, thinking he might find it interesting given what she knew about Duke. Miller took the book upstairs that evening. He sat in the chair by the window and he started reading. And about 60 pages in, he found the part of the story he had spent nearly 2 decades not looking for. The military dog program during and after the Korean War had a policy documented, institutional, and largely invisible to the public regarding dogs who could not be transferred, or whose handlers rotated out without viable reassignment options. These dogs were not always successfully placed. The program had intake capacity issues. The war's end created a surplus. Records from that period, already inconsistently maintained, suggest that a significant number of military working dogs from the Korean conflict were euthanized rather than returned stateside. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were sick, because they were, in the language of the institution, excess assets. Miller closed the book. He sat in the chair for a long time. His wife found him there an hour later and knew immediately from the way he was sitting very still, hands flat on the closed cover, that something had shifted in him. She asked what was wrong. He showed her the chapter. She read it slowly and then put her hand over his. He didn't cry that night. He didn't talk about it much either. What he did was go very quiet in a specific way. His family had learned to read over the years the quiet of a man, reorganizing something inside himself that had been built on a false assumption. He had believed Duke was reassigned. He had believed that because believing it was the only bearable option. He had built 2 decades of silence around that belief, and now the foundation of it was gone. In the weeks that followed, Miller started making calls. He contacted the Army. He wrote letters. He tried to find Duke's records, the file number, the transfer documentation, anything that might tell him what had actually happened to a specific dog in a specific kennel in Korea in the spring of 1953. Most of the records didn't exist anymore. The ones that did were incomplete. Nobody could tell him anything definitive. The Army's response, when it came, was courteous and offered nothing. But one letter came back from a veterans organization, a man who had served as a kennel master during the final months of the Korean conflict. He wrote carefully, aware of what he was saying. He confirmed that the post where Miller had been stationed had, in the months following the armistice, processed a number of dogs whose handlers had already shipped home. He could not confirm individual outcomes. He did not need to. Miller kept that letter in the book for the rest of his life. He never stopped thinking about the morning he left. Not the 48 hours before those he'd made some kind of peace with eventually, but the actual morning, the moment he chose not to look back. He would tell his daughter years later that the not looking back was the thing that stayed with him, that he'd thought at the time it was strength, discipline, the soldier thing to do, and maybe it was. But it also meant that his last image of Duke wasn't Duke, it was a kennel gate, and a dirt path, and the side of a transport truck. He never got to see Duke's face one more time. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. Here is what most people do not understand about the military dog programs of that era. The men who worked with these animals were not trained to grieve them. That wasn't part of the curriculum. You learned to work with the dog, to trust the dog, to read the dog under pressure. You were not taught what to do with the fact that the dog trusted you back completely, without reservation, the way dogs do, and that the institution you both served did not consider that trust a relevant factor in its logistical decisions. The handlers came home carrying something that didn't have a name yet. The VA wasn't asking about it. Nobody was asking about it. The assumption, if anyone thought about it at all, was that dogs were dogs and men were men, and grief was reserved for people. But Miller's daughters knew better. They grew up watching their father with every dog that came into their home, watching how present he was with them, how careful, how attentive. They understood, even before they had the words for it, that he was giving something to those dogs that he hadn't been allowed to finish giving to Duke. He lived into his late 80s. He outlived his wife by several years. Near the end, one of his daughters asked him if he'd ever made peace with what happened with the system, with the policy, with the morning he walked away. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said something she remembered exactly. He said, "I made peace with myself. Duke didn't get a choice. I did. I could have made more of a noise. I could have pushed harder. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. But I could have tried harder." She asked him what he would have done differently. He said, "I would have looked back." The story of Miller and Duke is not singular. It is one version of a thing that happened across an entire generation of handlers, men who came back, dogs who didn't, and a silence that lasted decades because nobody built a structure for those men to speak into. In the years following the Korean War, the American public was largely unaware that military working dogs had been used extensively in the conflict. The program wasn't secret, exactly, but it wasn't celebrated either. The dogs didn't get parades. Their handlers didn't get ceremonies. The work they did together existed mostly in the memories of the men who'd done it. And sometimes those memories were too tangled with loss to bring out easily in conversation. It wasn't until decades later, with advocacy from veterans groups, with gradually improving policy, with a shift in how the public understood the human-animal bond, that the culture around military working dogs began to change. Dogs that served became dogs that were honored. Some were brought home. Some were retired properly. Some received recognition that their Korean War predecessors never saw. But those earlier dogs, the ones who served in the hills and winters of Korea, who moved through enemy terrain on a long lead ahead of their handlers, who trusted completely and were classified as equipment, most of them are gone now, and most of the men who loved them are too. What remains is the shape of the thing, the letters in old books, the records that are incomplete, the daughters who remember how their fathers sat with the family dog too carefully, too intentionally, like men who were trying to give something back to an animal that couldn't receive it. Duke was one of them, a gray-coated scout dog with serious eyes, in a kennel in Korea in the spring of 1953. He did his job every single time he was asked. He trusted the man at the other end of the lead absolutely. And one morning, that man walked to a transport truck and didn't look back. Not because he didn't love him, because he thought it was the strong thing to do. Sometimes the most painful truths in history aren't the ones that involve cruelty. They're the ones that involve men doing what they were told, in systems that never accounted for what it costs to give an animal your full trust, and then have an institution decide that trust doesn't fit in the budget. Miller knew that by the end, and knowing it didn't fix anything, but he said it out loud to his daughter in his 80s in a living room with a dog at his feet. That matters too. Saying the thing out loud, even when it is late, even when the one who needed to hear it most can no longer receive it. Duke deserved better than the system gave him. So did every dog in that kennel. So did every man who walked away believing the lie that not looking back made it easier. If this story moved you, stay with that feeling for a moment. The dogs who served alongside soldiers in Korea didn't get monuments or parades, but their stories survive when we share them. If you want to hear more about the forgotten animals of wartime and the handlers who carried them home in memory, alone, this channel has more waiting for you. Some dogs become more than companions. They become legends. Subscribe now for more unbelievable true dog stories and explore the trusted gear and books we've linked below inspired by today's video.